stand on a thing so you can see me. If I fall off, I blame all of you. Hey, hello. Hey. Oh, I like lots of you. So, David died very suddenly and unexpectedly at the end of 2010. He was visiting a friend in Amsterdam and literally went to bed one night and didn't wake up. And that was obviously a great shock. We were working very closely together at the time, and he was one of my closest friends. And we had a co-authored parliamentary report that was due to come out about 3 or 4 weeks after that. So I was sort of thrown into this hurricane of suddenly having twice as much to do on the report, and having to deal with the fact that David wasn't there to do it with me or to present it and to organise the launch, etc. So I managed to get through that, and that was a real success, and in fact was internationally reported on. Time magazine did a feature on it, Bloomberg News, it was across the British media. I was interviewed on BBC. So it was a real sort of, tumult of interest. And then in the aftermath of that, of course, came the emotion, the sort of the grief of seeing all this amazing interest in David's work without him actually being there to know that this was happening. And then around that time as well, finding his manuscript for Lean Logic on his computer, and realizing that really his magnum opus, his life's work, wasn't yet out there in the world. A few of us who knew David very well started talking about what at the time we called the concise Lean Logic, which has now become Surviving the Future. And there was a process for maybe 18 months of working on going through all the entries, and we actually scored the entries in Lean Logic as to which ones we felt were, particularly good or essential, and then pulled those out and then started thinking about how it might be structured, and eventually ended up with a sort of a rough structure for the book, which I then started editing into an actual text. And about the time when I'd finished that process, just as a Word document, there's a journal called the Dark Mountain Journal. And Dark Mountain is very much around exploring the space of things that we're not really allowed to talk about in polite conversation, and particularly around the environmental crisis. And there's a sort of unspoken agreement amongst environmentalists that we mustn't ever admit that maybe we aren't going to head off unstoppable catastrophic climate change. We just we have to keep hoping and we have to keep fighting, and that can be quite exhausting, sort of pushing down the fears that are there because you're not really allowed to talk to anyone about them. And so Dark Mountain has provided this space for people to be able to talk about their feelings and their scenarios and their fears around how our future could look. And so they produce a journal once or twice a year with which they invite submissions of writing for. And for this particular issue, they said that their theme was going to be post-cautionary tales. And they said, we've heard enough cautionary tales. Now we want to hear stories about what happens after we ignore the cautionary tales. And it was kind of interesting for me because that was actually the first category I'd really heard that Lean Logic fit perfectly. It was very hard to categorize in many ways. In fact, one of the reviewers of Lean Logic described it as, he said, I've never encountered a book that is so hard to characterize, yet so hard despite its weight to put down. And that difficulty in characterizing it has very, very much been an issue as I've been talking to people about the book and publishers at that time. But post-cautionary tales, I thought, wow, that's really what this book is. And so I felt obliged to submit some entries, some extracts to Dark Mountain. and they absolutely loved them. They were overwhelmed by submissions for this particular issue, but they actually came back and said, "Well, we'd love to publish these, and also could you give us a second set for our next edition?" So I did that, and then Chelsea Green Publishing, who I'd previously worked with on a book of my own a few years before, were reading the Dark Mountain Journal, and so they read the extracts there, were very interested, and got in touch to see whether possibly they could help with publishing or distributing the work. And at the time, I initially talked to them about Surviving the Future, the paperback, and my hope was that that would go out into the world, hopefully meet with some success, and then if that did well, there might be demand for the full work, the Lean Logic. But actually, when I spoke to Chelsea Green, they said, "Well, that's not a bad plan, but actually, if people read the paperback and they get the bug, they're going to want to read the full thing there and then. They're not going to want to come back 2 years later when we've got around to publishing it." And so, rather to my surprise and delight, they said we'd love to publish both books simultaneously. So I was thrilled, but this dropped me into quite a lot of work because Lean Logic itself was not in its final form, and so over the last 2 or 3 years, that's been the central focus of my work, has been pulling together both books into their final published form with all that that's entailed. It's a classic David Fleming title in that it's very insightful to you once you've read the book. Once you understand what the book's all about, you really understand what the title is about. But of course, it can be quite mystifying to someone who hasn't read the book. So, this concept of lean thinking is something that really pervades David's work. And essentially, it's about the idea that the people who are on the ground doing the work, whatever the work may be, are the people who know what needs to change and what needs to be done. And if you've got some sort of upper management who are making all the decisions, well, they're so far removed from what's actually going on with the dirty-handed people who are getting the work actually done, that's very inefficient and ineffective. And so the lean aspect is all about people coming together, having conversations at the ground level and deciding what needs to be done and then getting on and doing it without the hierarchy. The logic part is about the fact that David felt that the art of logical argument and debate is in very poor health these days, and that an awful lot of what passes for debate in our media and in our public discourse is deeply flawed. And so one of the threads that runs through both books is his very amusing descriptions of some of the logical fallacies that we almost take for granted in common dialogue, and pointing out how mistaken they are. And so this concept of environmental manners, as he puts it, is about giving ideas the time and respect they need to really understand them and give them the hearing that they deserve. And then the paperback is called Surviving the Future: Culture, Carnival and Capital in the Aftermath of the Market Economy. Now, of course, this book, David had no idea it was ever going to exist. He'd just produced this epic dictionary. And so I felt a little uncomfortable when I was coming up with a title for it. I felt like, do I really have the right to choose a title for David's work? And so Surviving the Future is obviously derived from his subtitle, A Dictionary for the Future and How to Survive It. And so really that was a sort of homage to the origins of the work with him. But the subtitle, Culture, Carnival and Capital in the Aftermath of the Market Economy, I think says a lot more about his vision of what Surviving the Future could look like, and what a positive, nourishing vision it is. And for me, that is what's most exciting about these books, is David Fleming's vision of an alternative economy, an alternative society that's very different from our neoliberal, market-based current way of life, that's based much more in community, in culture, in carnival, in conviviality, this sense of really enjoying life and coming together as a culture. And his writing goes so deeply into what culture means in such a nourishing and enjoyable way. And that, I think, is really inspiring, because I've struggled to see an alternative vision that's really compelling out there, that's thought through, that's rigorous. He had a PhD in economics. He wasn't just bluffing it, but is also very accessible, very warm and friendly, and just lays out exactly the kind of life that that we want to live in. He says in the books that modern conventional economics is what puts the grim into reality, and that his vision is of a world in which there's time for music. And hopefully the subtitle for the paperback helps to get across that emphasis on culture and carnival as the basis, genuinely the basis for an economy that isn't based on the impossibility of perpetual growth. So yeah, right now in the middle of this book tour, which is a bit overwhelming to be honest. There's a huge amount of interest in the books, which is great, but a lot of hard work. We started off at the Dark Mountain Festival, and people there were somewhat familiar with the book in that some extracts were published in the Dark Mountain Journal a few years ago, but really excited to hear more. And I ran a workshop there, which I really didn't know actually how to run a workshop around these books. Lean Logic being such an unusually formatted book, I found myself thinking, well, how on earth am I going to convey the sheer wide-ranging nature of it? I mean, if I do some readings from it, they're going to represent less than 1% of the book. And so actually only on the day came up with the idea of literally just getting people to call out topics, any topic at all, not necessarily related to anything they might know about the book. And people would just shout out topics, and then I would read something from the book that spoke to what they were calling out, and that seemed to work really well. And obviously only time to deal with a certain number of topics, but that managed to convey what a broad range they were, and wonderful number of books were sold at that event. Then there have been a number of other events, and then a few weeks ago was the main book launch celebration in London, which was at Daunt Books in Chelsea. And that was just just a lot more fun. I wasn't really presenting there other than doing a few readings from the book, but it was really wonderful to be surrounded by sort of everyone I knew from every aspect of my life, and lots of David Fleming's old friends. So that was very very nourishing actually, to have a lot of people coming up and shaking my hand and saying thank you for getting David's legacy out there in the way that it deserves, really, and that the world deserves, I think. A couple of weeks ago, I was at Oxford University, which was David Fleming's alma mater, where he studied modern history. And I was there with Jonathan Porritt, who I didn't really realise this until quite recently, but he also saw David Fleming as something of a mentor when they, during the 70s, really helped to kick off what's now the Green Party in this country. And so Jonathan and I went down, had a very enjoyable couple of hours at Trinity College there, organised by their alumnus office, with maybe 40 people came along to that event, and that was a really nice sort of conversational atmosphere, and I think everyone left that really, really enthused and buzzing about the books. And there was a wonderful review on Amazon.com, the American Amazon, just the other day actually, which was saying reading Lean Logic reminded me of hours lost in encyclopedias as a child, but instead of reading about birch bark and howitzers, I'm learning about the sort of imperative to redefine our culture and what it means to live a good life in today's world, which I thought was pretty wonderful review to be reading. I had a wonderful email from a writer called John Michael Greer, who's a bit of a long-term hero of mine in America. I've never met him, and he didn't know David, but the publishers sent him a copy of Lean Logic, and he wrote to me just to say thank you for bringing this work to the world. He said it's he described it as one of the very few recent books that I would place on the same shelf as Schumacher's Small is Beautiful and William Catton's Overshoot. And as a long-term follower of his writing, John Michael Greer, I know that that's the highest praise possible from him. So it's been really gratifying to see that it wasn't just me who thought these books were. There's a wonderful review of the book by Andrew Sims of the New Economics Foundation, which David was involved in starting, and he says, David Fleming was an iconoclast in a time when orthodox thinking reasserted suffocating control. When many major voices had in effect decided to go with the flow and accept the mainstream economy, David Fleming went the other way. His analysis told him that nothing short of a paradigm shift could ensure our collective survival, and he said so loudly, without fear of being marginalised. So one of the challenges when pulling together the paperback Surviving the Future was that it's a conventional read it front to back book, so it has to have an ending. And of course, the dictionary doesn't have an ending, it's a dictionary. And so my approach to that was to create an epilogue, which is pulled together from a number of different entries in the dictionary. And this is that epilogue, which is entitled Mourning the Market. The great transformation has already happened. It was the revolution in politics, economics and society that came with the market economy, and which hit its stride in Britain in the late 18th century. Most of human history has been bred, fed and watered by another sort of economy, but the market has replaced, as far as possible, the social capital of reciprocal obligation, loyalties, authority structures, culture and traditions, with exchange, price and the impersonal principles of economics. Unfortunately, the critics of economics have had a tendency to discuss the whole structure as a tissue of misconceptions. It is a critique that fails. The strength of economics is its considerable, if far from complete, understanding of the flows and comparative advantages that underlie trade, jobs, capital and incomes, and the logic of optimizing behaviour, all backed by glittering accomplishments in mathematics. That makes it a powerful analytical instrument, so that just a few misconceptions, such as a failure to understand the informal economy or resource depletion, can have leverage. Like a baby monkey at the controls of a Ferrari, they can turn it into an instrument with extraordinarily destructive potential. If it were a tissue of errors, it would not be dangerous. It is its 90% brilliance which makes it so. Economics has therefore been seductive. The market economy is effective for sustaining social order. The distribution of goods, services and other assets is facilitated by buying and selling, supporting a network of exchange to which everyone has access. It provides suppliers with the incentive to know their markets and respond to them. It is responsive rather than relying on top-down regulation, and it learns from experience, so it is effective and efficient. It supports a more egalitarian society than any other large-scale state has been capable of, and it saves a great deal of trouble. It has appealed to minds glad of a cognitive technology which enabled them to make decisions according to mathematical models, and with little fear of contradiction. Douce commerce, sweet commerce, wrote Jacques Savary, an early management consultant in a 1685 textbook for businessmen, makes for all the gentleness of life. The authorities themselves agreed. Commerce is, quote, the most innocent and legitimate way of acquiring wealth, observed an edict of the French government in 1669. It is, quote, the fertile source which brings abundance to the state and spreads it among its subjects. Indeed, the government's main task in a mature market economy is to keep it free of obstacles that might stop it growing, like a bemused farmer would treat the enchanted goose. Keep the foxes out so it can go on magically laying its golden eggs. The market's achievements and answers sound authoritative and final, but what is truly most significant about them is how naive they are. If the flow of income fails, the powerfully bonding combination of money and self-interest will no longer be available on its present all-embracing scale, and perhaps not at all. And it must inevitably fail, as the market's taught competitiveness demands ever-increasing productivity and thus relies on the impossibility of perpetual growth. In the meantime, the reduction of a society and culture to dependence on mathematical abstraction has infantilized a grown-up civilization and is well on the way to destroying it. Civilizations self-destruct anyway, but it is reasonable to ask whether they have done so before with such enthusiasm and in obedience to such an acutely absurd superstition, all while climbing with such insistence that they were beyond being seduced by the irrational promises of religion. Every civilization has had its irrational but reassuring myth. Previous civilizations have used their culture to sing about it and tell stories about it. Ours has used its mathematics to prove it. Yet when this relatively short-lived market society is gone, we will miss its essential simplicity, its price mechanism, its self-stabilizing properties, its impersonal exchange, the comforts it delivers to many and the freedoms it underwrites. Its failure will be destructive. And the end is in sight. During the early decades of the century, the market will lose its magic. It is the aim of lean logic to suggest some principles for repairing or replacing the atrophied social structures on which most human cultures were built, as the basis for a cohesive society that might survive the turbulent times to come. A work that I, in a way felt a bit alone with. I found it on David's computer and sort of was reading it and thinking, gosh, this is really something that... Distraction! Oh, a lot! If we've got science fiction, I think of it a bit as cultural fiction, rather than thinking about how is science going to shape our future. This is about how is culture going to shape our future, and how do we shape our culture.
Any suggestions?
Right, so supporter, and of course somebody who's dedicated an enormously long part of his own life to get to where we are today with these books. So
that the world could do with reading, that feels like a genuinely important work. And obviously part of my motivation for doing it was my great love for David and my gratitude for all that he was in my life, and wanting to see his life's work reach fruition, but also, the sense that this is a book that the world could need at the moment, and that it's been really exciting to see that a lot of people in the world have felt the same way when they're reading it.
For me, after several years' work to bring these books to their final form, and of course for David for several decades' work